Good afternoon. We're very pleased to have with us the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, John Holmes, who has just returned from Sri Lanka. Mr. Holmes.
Thank you very much, Farhan. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd give you a quick account of my visit there and the situation as it is at the moment. As you probably know, I spent 2 days in Sri Lanka on Sunday and Monday. I was able to meet the President, various key ministers and senior officials, and of course the humanitarian actors on the ground. And in Colombo, I paid a visit to northern Sri Lanka, in particular to the area around Vavunia, where most of the displaced people actually are in the camps there. There are basically 3 areas of concern, I would say, about what's happening at the moment. The first, and by far the most serious and urgent, is the position of the tens of thousands of civilians still trapped in the what we no longer call the no-fire or safe zone, but I think is more correctly described as the combat zone. And we believe there are some 50,000 civilians still trapped there. It may be more, it may be less. The government's figures are much less, but we think 50,000 is a reasonable figure for an estimate of how many left there. It's certainly a significant number. And of course, these people are in great danger from the continuing fighting. The civilian casualties, the numbers of civilian casualties hitherto has been pretty horrific in the last 3 months, as we've said before. So these people are certainly at great risk, and the top priority has to be getting them out of there as soon as possible, to get them out of that position, because they're not only in danger from the shelling and shooting, but also because their position in terms of food and other basic supplies is also very poor. There has been some food going in there over recent days. The ICRC evacuation ship, which is coming in and out effectively every two days or so, is able to bring in 30 tons of food, around 30 tons of food each trip. But 30 tons of food with a population of 50,000 civilians, if that's what it is, doesn't go very far. There's also a need for medical supplies. I think some medical supplies got in there yesterday, but there's a need for more, and there are constant problems with shelter, clean water, sanitation, and so on. So the position of the civilians who are trapped there is extremely poor and extremely worrying. We have been urging on the government, as have others, a further humanitarian pause. You can call it a ceasefire if you like, at this present position, but essentially a humanitarian pause for the sake of the people who are trapped there. But so far the government have not been willing to contemplate that on the grounds that the LTT simply exploits any pause to regroup militarily and continue their resistance. But we continue to ask for that because we need that, not least to get in more humanitarian aid, to get in more food. There's a larger ship which the ICRC also sails under the ICRC flag, which can carry 1,000 tons of food, but that's not been able to dock in recent days since the mass exodus of last week, because it needs a longer period to unload, and the conditions have not been there for it to do that. As you all know, we also want to be able to have some access for our UN humanitarian staff to that combat zone to assess what the conditions are and to provide a better position on which more humanitarian can get in there on the basis of proper assessments, but we've not been able to achieve that so far. I discussed that while I was there, and the view of the President was very clear that such a mission at the moment would not be safe or appropriate, and that therefore he couldn't give that agreement. But we will continue to pursue that because we think it's worthwhile getting in there as soon as possible. So that, as I say, the position of the civilians in that zone is the top priority. Then we have the second question of how to respond in humanitarian terms to the very large numbers of people who've been displaced, who've escaped from the combat zone. It's at around 175,000 people altogether since the beginning of the year, the vast majority of whom are in and around Vavunia, either in transit centres in schools in Vavunia itself, or at a very large IDP site in a place called Menik Farms, which I visited on Monday. The exodus of about 110,000 people in the course of last week, in a very short space of time, of course, has posed, despite advanced planning, very considerable logistical challenges in terms of shelter and food and water and other basic services. I think we're beginning to get a grip on that. The government and UN agencies and NGOs have been doing a heroic job in putting up very large numbers of tents in a very short time on this Manic Farm site. I think 4,500 tents went up in the space of 4 days to cope with all the IDPs there. A large number of further tents, I think, which should be just arriving from UNHCR, flown in over the weekend, and other supplies are beginning to arrive as well. So, although the conditions are very far from satisfactory in that camp and in those transit centres, I think with huge efforts we're beginning to get a grip on that, and the basics will be there in order to allow people to at least survive, and we will be able to continuously improve their conditions as we go along. But there are some very significant challenges still there. The third area of concern obviously is a familiar one, I think, which is the questions of the longer term future of the people in the camps, how far they're going to be allowed freedom of movement, how quickly they're going to be able to return home to their places of origin, questions about family reunification, military presence in the camps, and so on. These are issues we've raised before. I raised them very strongly during my earlier visit to Sri Lanka at the end of February. They were also raised by Walter Kalin, who's the Secretary General's representative on the human rights of internally displaced people, and he produced a draft plan of action to deal with these problems, which I think the government accept is the right way to go, but we need to see some action in these areas to make sure that the right standards and principles are being met for the people who are in these camps. So that's something we need to go on pursuing very forcibly with the government. Not least the question, as I say, of returns at the earliest possible stage when the demining has been completed of areas which have been cleared. And all this matters because of the fate of the civilians themselves, but also the longer-term political position that needs to be addressed as soon as the conflict is over, to reach an equitable political settlement involving the Tamils, one which is seen to be equitable by the Tamils themselves, to make sure that we don't fall back into a situation of violence in the future. So that's the basic position that we've reached. It's disappointing that we've not been able to achieve the kind of further humanitarian pause that we were looking for, or the kind of humanitarian mission into the combat zone that we were looking for, but we'll continue to pursue those issues. And meanwhile, it's very important that the government continues to exercises restraint, particularly in the use of heavy weapons, which they've said again earlier in the week they will not use in that zone. I hope very much that promise will be respected. As I've said before, it's not been respected hitherto, certainly not fully, so I hope it will be. And of course it's still vital that the LTTE themselves let the civilians who they are holding against their will go, let them out to safety, and preferably lay down their arms and surrender in the position we're in to avoid further fighting and further loss of life. Unfortunately, at the moment, both sides are pursuing their military logics, if I can put it that way, and therefore that's the reason why we're in such a difficult position. So let me stop there and answer your questions.
Philippe?
Do you have any idea of what's happening in the screening process? Have you been able to go to any of these places where people are being screened, or any UN personnel, have they been able to go down?
Well, I was able to visit on Monday afternoon the main screening centre at a place called Omentai, which is on the border of the formerly LTTE held zone and the area south of that. Actually, there were no people being screened there at the time, because everybody who had escaped earlier in the week, or last week I should say, had already been through that process, and there was nobody, or very, very few people left on the other side of that screening centre to come through. But of course, as people escape from the zone further, they will come through that centre. UNHCR has a presence at that screening centre, and I was able to talk to the UNHCR person who was there and to visit the screening centre itself. It's a very open centre. It's a sort of open huts, as it were, where people are screened. And that process seems to work reasonably well, by all accounts, and I don't think there were too many concerns about what happens there. ICRC are not present in the screening centre itself, but they're on the other side of the screening centre, so that when people come out of it, they can make sure that they're being looked after properly on their way to the camps. So, although we would like UNHCR to have even closer supervision of that screening centre, in the sense of being able to talk to people as they're being screened, I think we do have at least a presence there, and we're able to observe how that works. So our concern has been not so much about that as about what happens before the people who've escaped get to that point. In other words, in the areas between the combat zone and Omentai, around Kilinochi or elsewhere, where they are received by the army, and where presumably some kind of initial screening of, for example, hardcore LTT cadres may take place. We have no visibility of that, and of course there have been allegations of abuses there, but we don't have any evidence of such abuses. But as long as we don't have any visibility of it and it's not transparent, then those stories will be there. So that's why we have been pressing for access to that area as well.
Just to follow up on that, do the UNHCR staff, for example, who talk to refugees, do they get lots of testimonies of this kind of abuse? And what are the allegations exactly? Is it that people are being executed on the spot, or what kind of abuse are talked about?
Well, those are the kind of allegations which are made, by Tamil sources of various kinds. As far as I'm aware, we have not been given directly stories of that kind. But I can't swear in every case, but I'm not aware of any body of evidence of accusations of that kind directly to UNHCR or to others. However, I think what is concerning is that families are often separated in either accidentally or deliberately in some way in the process of coming out, and then they're put in different camps. So people often don't know where their other family members are. Now that may be, in most cases, perfectly innocent. They're simply in different camps because that's the way it's finished up. And that's why family reunification efforts and registration efforts are so important. But I think the fact that family members are sometimes separated is giving rise to worries about disappearances and so on. As I say, those stories are certainly there. We don't have hard evidence of that, but until we have proper access and proper accounting for everybody, then those stories are going to continue.
Matthew?
When Vijay Nambiar came back, the Secretary General put out a statement saying that he had gotten the agreement to have a humanitarian assessment team into the conflict zone. If you could say, when you went there, what changed, or how did they explain this change? And also, there's a controversy now about some satellite photos that have been produced by UNOSAT of the UNITAR agency, where they've taken, or bought photos of the conflict zone. They say there's craters and crater damage reports. Some are saying that the UN should have released those photos when they got them, and that they did so in Gaza. I don't know if Mr. Lopez of UNITAR just said that in the Gaza case it was for a donor group, so they got released. In this case, I don't know who it was for, but could you say what OCHA's role in getting these photos and making, I guess, either withholding or producing them? And then just finally, on UN staff, if you can say what the status of the staff that are being detained is, and there are also reports that 2 humanitarian staff members and their families were arrested last year, arrested by the government, actually imprisoned, for renting a room to a supposed LTT support staff member and a UNOPS driver for not speaking Sinhala. And people seem to think that OCHA knew about this and didn't say anything. Maybe that may be small, that's why I put it at the end of the question list.
Well, on the mission, yes, indeed, we had the strong impression that after Vijay Nambiar's mission, the government had agreed to a small technical humanitarian mission going into the combat zone, and pursued it on that basis. Now, in between my own visit and that of Vijay Nambiar's, the position was that yes, we have no objection in principle to that mission going in, but of course, this was from our side, the security conditions have got to be right. We need to have a certain degree of assurance that any mission going in there will be safe. For that to happen, there has to be at least some kind of minimal humanitarian pause because of our own internal security regulations apart from anything else. So we were saying to the government, we need you to provide conditions which are conducive to this kind of visit, to allow at least a visit of a few hours on the ground to be able to assess the situation. And that, of course, ran into the problem of the humanitarian pause argument, if you like. And that was a position with most of those I discussed it with while I was there. When I met the President, he made clear he did not think this kind of mission, in present circumstances, following what had happened in the zone since Vijay Nambiar had been there, that this sort of mission was safe because of the danger of being misused in some way, I think, by the LTTE, or indeed necessary or appropriate. So he was not prepared to agree to such a mission, and that's the position we are in at the moment. I hope that will be, we'll continue to press for it, and I hope that there will be second thoughts at some stage. And of course it is, as I say, linked to the idea of at least a minimal kind of pause in terms of firing by the government and of course by the LTTE to allow that kind of mission to happen. I mean, of course the ICRC ships do go in and out every day or every other day, but they're operating on a very limited area of beach, and is therefore sufficiently they're able to negotiate minimum conditions of security for those unloadings and evacuation of civilians. We would need rather more than that. On your second point, I mean, we have seen some photos, satellite photos from UNOSAT. We haven't sat on them, and I think the question of whether they should be released is really one for UNOSAT themselves. If they're prepared to see them released, we have absolutely no problem with that. We haven't been trying to suppress them. I don't quite know what the UNITAR role is in that, but as I say, we have no problem with them being released if UNOSAT are prepared to release them. On the question of UN staff, we have continued to raise that, and I raised that at every level while I was there. And the position is that the government are looking into this very positively, making every effort to get them released, but the fact is they have not yet been released. I hope that will happen very soon, because it's unacceptable that they should still be held in the camps in the way that they are. On the arrests you're talking about, I have no information. It doesn't, I'm afraid, ring any bells with me. We can look into it, but I can't add anything.
Jonathan?
Mr. Holmes, I have two questions. One's purely comparative, that is 4,500 tents in 4 days, that's more than 1,000 tents a day. Is that some kind of record? I mean, it's actually, on a comparative basis, it seems like an astounding figure. The larger question is, when you spoke to the President, was there any discussion of the non-land problem? In other words, the insurgents have both talked about and have indicated the possibility of some kind of Dunkirk-like or MacArthur leaving the Philippines sea escape, and the Sri Lankan Navy has been quite ruthless in blowing boats out of the water. And there's no verification of who's on the boats. Has there been any discussion at any level about evacuation by sea and people who work with you or in other UN organizations having a chance to talk to those who try and escape by sea?
On your first question, I have no idea whether it's a record. I think it was a fairly outstanding achievement, an astonishing achievement to get so many tents up in such a short time in very difficult conditions. But I honestly couldn't say whether that's a record. There have been similar situations with millions, I mean hundreds of thousands of people turning up in different places in DRC, but I don't know how well that's been dealt with. On your second question, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, but there has been talk at different times of, if the LTT were willing to let the population go, would it be possible to evacuate them by sea as opposed to land? And clearly, in a sense, it would if you had the capacity there to do it. But the option of land has always seemed much easier, because I mean, people can walk across the lines very, very quickly and easily, especially now that the front lines are so close and the area is so limited. So there's no particular thought of evacuation by sea at this stage. But you know, if that was a way to get people out, we would certainly contemplate it. I don't know whether there has been serious attempts by LTT leaders or others to escape by sea. I mean, I've heard stories about that, but I've not seen any hard evidence of that. And I think the assumption of people I talked to there was that the leadership are still there, although it's very hard to know for certain.
The communist press in India has had a number of accounts of boats coming offshore and simply being sunk. And no one knows who's on the boats, and there have been at least informed speculation that the leadership may try to escape by sea.
No, I mean, I've seen that speculation, and it's possible if they want to escape. It's not clear whether they would want to escape or not, or whether they would want some of the leadership to escape to keep the flame alive somewhere or whatever. Certainly there's a lot of naval activity, and I think the Sea Tigers are still active, as far as I can judge. But you know, how far there's serious attempts made to smuggle people out or to let some people out, you know, I'm really not in a position to say. I don't know the facts.
We have time for just a couple more questions. Mr. Holmes is meeting at 12:30. Mark?
Just a question on precedents. The Sri Lankan government's been pretty effective on preventing a robust humanitarian operation. They've been even more effective at keeping foreign journalists out. Are you worried about the precedent that this may set for future situations where, as long as the governments or parties are effective in keeping journalists and humanitarian aid workers out, that it's hard to get political motivation to other countries to get involved and to bring pressure when no one can provide reliable statistics on casualties and things of the sort to kind of get some type of pressure momentum?
Well, it's a fair question. I mean, I think your first comment is perhaps exaggerated in saying that they've been effective at preventing a humanitarian operation. We haven't had problems in mounting a humanitarian operation for those who have escaped from the zone. What we have, of course, had problems with is inside the zone. Until the end of last year, we were able to mount land convoys into that zone to provide food assistance and so on. But as the fighting intensified, then that's what disappeared, and then we've had to rely essentially on these sea operations under the ICRC flag, which have been effective in one sense at getting a lot of people out. I think 12,000 people have been evacuated by the ICRC, about half of them injured, and half of them people going with them. And we have been able to get some food and medical supply and other things in that way, WFP food. But yes, I mean, there has been no effective access, at least since the beginning of the year, for the UN humanitarian operations and for the journalists. And that does mean that there's very little visibility of what is going on. I hope very much that doesn't set precedents, because that would be worrying. And I think it is a development we have to watch. But whether it will become a precedent, I can't say. I just say I would very much hope not.
But in terms of, I realize that the International Red Cross can dock the ship, get food out. But in terms of being on the ground and monitoring them, isn't that a huge part of a humanitarian operation, to be able to tell exactly who's getting the aid, who needs the aid, that type of thing? I mean, I realize you can get things to them, but...
No, I agree. Sorry, I wasn't disagreeing with that point. I mean, I think in the latest weeks, at least, the area has been so small and so dangerous that actually having UN humanitarian staff on the ground on any permanent basis would have been very difficult in any case. And that's why we need a humanitarian pause in order to get staff on the ground now. At an earlier stage, when the area was much wider and the fighting was not so intense, then we would have very much welcomed. I mean, we were excluded from the area in last September against our wishes by the government, and have had very little visibility of what's been going on since then. So in that sense, I agree with you. All I'm saying is I hope that it does not form a precedent, because access is absolutely fundamental to everything we do. Without access, then we can't obviously help the people who need the help.
And just a quick follow-up. In terms of the latest statistics you're able to provide in terms of casualties or deaths or anything relating to this conflict, I mean...
Nothing very, beyond what we've said already, that the casualty rate has been very high, several thousand certainly, but we can't put exact numbers on that with any authority, as I've said before. But unfortunately, I fear that those casualty numbers we've talked about dozens a day in the past, I think that's continuing.
Okay. One last question.
That's okay. I've got 5 minutes.
On the casualty numbers, actually, why don't you? I mean, the numbers that the UN have been using have been leaked left and right. In the past, you've used, for example, on Darfur, some very soft numbers to describe the casualty, so some loose estimates, using studies made years earlier in the conflict. why don't you come out with a sort of official estimation by the UN of what the casualties are, and don't you think that would help, mobilize the international community?
Well, obviously, we have looked at this issue carefully. People have made the comparison with Gaza. What about the casualty figures you used for Gaza? Well, the casualty figures we used for Gaza were not our casualty figures. They were the casualty figures of the Palestinian Ministry of Health. And I was always careful to point that out when we were talking about them. But we also said they were credible. We thought they were credible in terms of the sort of general order of numbers that we were talking about. In this case, there is no equivalent of the Palestinian Ministry of Health. There's no other source of information which has any reliability or credibility. So we've been putting together these figures on the basis of what evidence we can gather from those on the ground, but in such a way that it's, we don't feel able to put them out as official UN casualty figures with any degree of being able to defend them fully. Having said that, there's kind of numbers that have been leaked. We believe, we certainly believe, are they're in the right ballpark, and that's why we're so concerned about the situation. I mean, the comparison with the Darfur figures is different again, because it was based on a baseline survey in the first place, and we simply don't have any reliable statistics in that kind of way to use here. But I think the important thing is not what the exact figure is that we are talking about thousands of civilian casualties in the course of the last few months, and a level of civilian casualties which is extremely worrying.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Is there any pressure by the authorities on the UN or OCHA not to release these numbers, threatening to not give any access if they are leaked? No,
the government disagree violently with the numbers, and don't like any kind of publication of them, but that's not the reason we haven't published them, and they haven't made any specific threats in that sense.
Just one follow-up on the numbers, how they're created. There was an NGO briefing here, and one of the NGOs said that the doctors in the conflict zone, who until the recent phase were being paid by the government stopped paying them, and in fact, she said, threatened them that if they were to produce numbers, that they would suffer consequences when they came out. Is the UN aware of this in any way, and how would that play out? And then just one thing, if you can just say, who is running kind of the political? You mentioned political settlement, post-conflict scenario. Is this now, even though you're the head of OCHA, was this Mr. Nambiar's role? Who in the UN is trying to look at, like, some people say the IMF loan is some form of leverage, or some AU tariffs? Is there anyone in the UN system that's looking at both sides, the political future and the humanitarian, or is that person you?
Well, on the casualty figures, there is controversy about the position of the doctors there, and whatever information they may be able to provide, because the government at least says these people are obviously operating, however worthy they may be as individuals, under pressure from the LTT, and therefore whatever they say cannot be taken at face value. We have tried to allow for that, to cross-check and to make sure that the figures we have in our private estimates are as good as they can be. But because we have reservations about how fully defensible they are, that's why we've not put them out as official figures, to repeat myself. On the political issues, I'm certainly not responsible for the political follow-up. I think the position is that the UN will be willing to play a role in political discussions in the future, but at the moment the government have not been prepared to allow us to play any role. We're happy to play a role if the government would like us to in the future, but that's still a theoretical position.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.